Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being co-hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance and the World Forum Offshore Wind. Our topic for today's webinar is an introduction to floating wind technology and markets. We have a really exciting panel of speakers lined up for you today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over some quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone or connect via your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to expand your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on that arrow to minimize your webinar console. One thing you might like to do with your webinar console is to type in your questions. We will be saving some time at the end for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So do type your questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can, as I said. So this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides either today or tomorrow. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on our website at CESA.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's where we post all of our upcoming and archived webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, my colleague Sam Schacht. Sam works with me here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will get us started.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for being here. And before we jump into all of the wonderful offshore wind stuff today, I just wanted to say a little bit about what CESA is. So the Clean Energy Alliance is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. And CESA members, mostly state agencies, but not exclusively, include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives in the country. And Sam, if you could move me to the next slide, please. Today, our webinar is gonna look a little bit like this. We've already done our webinar logistics. We're gonna introduce, I've just introduced CESA. I'm gonna introduce our speakers and then introduce the World Forum Offshore Wind, which is co-hosting this event with us. And then we will have an overview of the global floating offshore wind industry by Adrienne Downey of Hexicon. And then she will have a really nice fireside chat with the California Energy Commissioner, Kourtney Vaccaro, and there will be some time for questions at the end. And as Sam said, please feel free to put those questions in the chat and we'll be able to pull them up when we're ready at the end of the webinar. So today I am moderating and I have Mike Matthews here from World Forum Offshore Wind, who you'll hear from in just a moment. But I wanted to take just a couple minutes to introduce our two guest speakers today. The first is Adrienne Downey. She is the principal engineer and country manager for the US and Canada for the Hexicon Group, a floating offshore wind developer headquartered in Sweden. Adrienne worked as executive director for business development for turbine manufacturer Enercon before serving as principal engineer for offshore wind at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Adrienne serves as a board member for a number of offshore wind organizations, including the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, Offshore Wind California, and Marine Renewables Canada. And she holds an engineering degree from McGill University and a master's degree from the Pratt Institute. Our other esteemed guest today is California Energy Commissioner Kourtney Vaccaro, who's serving her first term on the California Energy Commission. Governor Gavin Newsom appointed Vaccaro in March 2022 to serve as the Energy Commission's attorney member. She worked as an advisor to Commissioner Karen Douglas since 2019. Since 2009, Vaccaro has held multiple positions at the Energy Commission, including Chief Counsel, Assistant Executive Director of Compliance Assistance and Enforcement, Attorney, and Hearing Advisor. She was a partner at Vaccaro LLP from 2012 to 2013. She worked at the Fair Political Practices Commission between 2006 and 2009, where she served as Enforcement Division Chief, Assistant Chief of Enforcement, and Senior Commission Counsel. Vaccaro worked as an attorney at Best and Krieger. She earned a JD and master's degree in public administration from the University of Southern California, and she earned a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. So there's a lot to look forward to from those two speakers. And I do want to tell you all a little bit about CESA's work on offshore wind before we get started. So at CESA here, we have our offshore wind accelerator project, which supports the development of the offshore wind market and informs the policies that enable a just transition to clean energy by engaging states in information sharing and network to advance cross-learning and regional cooperation, engaging with community-based organizations to promote equitable offshore wind development, and communicating with a wide range of stakeholders to advance the public discourse. And the next slide should tell us about the World Forum Offshore Wind. So I'm going to pass it over. Oh, there is one more slide on the learning exchange. That's the, no worries, that's the specific portion of our offshore wind accelerator project that is hosting this webinar. And the learning exchange specifically aims to educate an American audience about the advancement of the European offshore wind industry and share lessons learned from a more mature offshore wind industry than ours. We host a peer-to-peer forum for EU and US officials to exchange and learn, and we try to strengthen ties among US states actively engaged in offshore wind development. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Mike Matthews of the World Forum Offshore Wind to talk a little bit about his work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. Really appreciate it. I'm Mike Matthews. I'm the U.S. representative to WFO, World Forum Offshore Wind, and we are a global nonprofit with 95 plus. We're actually at 102 companies as of this morning, member firms spanning the global offshore wind supply chain. So from developers all the way down towards our tier 3 and 4 folks that are making up the global supply chain. Very happy here to have Commissioner Vaccaro and Adrienne Downey, as well as the Clean Energy States Alliance co-host this with us. Obviously, it's a great fit with all of the work they're doing at the state level. And we are the global organization. Again, headquartered in Hamburg, Germany. We have offices in New York, where I'm located, Taiwan, and Japan, and we are looking to build out the global industry, which is, of course, a tall order given all of the activity that is going on around the globe. We focus not just on fixed bottom, but our bread and butter is really the emerging floating offshore wind industry, and we have 4 main areas of focus. So if you don't mind going to the next slide. So seeing this chart on the right-hand side, our Floating Offshore Wind Committee is a member-driven entity within the WFO where we really try to tackle some of those challenging and pressing issues that are facing the global floating offshore wind industry, and that is operations and maintenance, the insurability of these projects as well. Moorings are a big deal right now, as we're seeing off of California, and of course, cables and floating substations is a new one. New announcement as of just a couple of days ago, we do have a hydrogen subcommittee as well. And what we do is each of these subcommittees meets on a monthly basis and puts out regular kind of guidance documents for the industry on a quarterly basis. So I definitely implore you to check out WFO.org, check out some of our white papers, read about operations and maintenance, our mooring systems, and please reach out to me with any questions about what we do across the globe. Thank you very much. Apologies, I can't forget to introduce our esteemed guest here. Adrienne Downey, of course, is works with the Hexicon Group, who is a floating offshore wind developer out of Sweden. Adrienne is the principal engineer for Hexicon and the country manager for both the US and Canada. We're very happy to have her here today, and I will hand it to you, Adrienne.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it. And Looking forward to today's webinar. Thank you very much, of course, Mike, to WFO for hosting, as well as Sam with CESA, and Sam too in the background here, who is our tech guru on the backside. Many thanks for your support. So indeed, I'm Adrienne Downey. I'm the principal engineer and country lead for Hexicon in the US, as well as in Canada. So with a purview of North America, we're all things floating all the time, and eager to have an opportunity to introduce our group, but mostly in kicking off this webinar series, what we'd really like to do is help set the stage a little bit on the state of play with regards to floating offshore wind, recognizing that shockingly not everyone is up to speed or knowledgeable about this subject. So we'll use the opportunity to set the stage on a couple of key elements before we dive into really the main event, which is a conversation that I'm tremendously honored to participate with our fair commissioner, Kourtney Vaccaro. So without further ado, let's dive in. So again, I think we should just be mindful that the presentation is being, or today's webinar, excuse me, is being recorded, and these slides will be made available. So I will not suffer anyone's patience here by reading the fine print, but rather want to use, a quick blitz here to bring us all up to speed. So really, the conversation about offshore wind and now in this next chapter, floating offshore wind, is really the continuation of an important dialogue that has been accelerating globally. So ultimately, the growing role of renewable energy is really a pivotal portion, of our collective work and drive to reduce global CO2 reductions. The expectation is that between 2020 and 2050, we're going to see or aggressively try to collectively displace across multiple global markets, the role in our electricity system of conventional fossil fuel sources, so coal, gas, nuclear, and other potential sources, and really to drive high penetration of not only clean technologies but renewable technologies, which is of course where solar and wind play a major role. So wind, when we look at the 2050 construct, could be as much as 40% of global capacity, and that again is really tantamount to driving reductions in greenhouse gases as aggressively as we can in order to mitigate, what is a truly existential threat, which is the effects of climate change that we're collectively mindful of and already seeing the effects of. And so, as we look from a prior position as a policymaker, as well as my current position in industry, it's important to understand, why are we looking at offshore wind and why are we now looking at floating wind? Well, ultimately it comes to the question of that 40% of wind opportunity and potential is a tremendous resource. And as we go into deeper waters, which is ultimately the differentiator. So if you've heard of offshore wind, it's large-scale wind development in the ocean. And to date, most of this effort, especially in the United States, has been concentrated in shallower waters, so so-called fixed bottom offshore wind. As we move into greater water depths or deeper water depths, and that's certainly the case in California, we'll touch upon that shortly, we get into a slightly different version of that technological application, which is floating wind. So floating wind is often what is referred to as offshore wind that is in water depths in excess of around 60 meters. And so as we go into deeper waters and as we go further off of shore, we find ourselves into a very compelling mix of enormous wind resource potential with high availability rates, high capacity factors is the term of art that's used in the industry, as well as important improvements in terms of minimizing the environmental footprint that is associated with the construction and operation of these projects, as well as significant opportunity for industrialization. And so really it's the ability to unlock large-scale wind in pursuit of our decarbonization goals that is so abundantly important. And so when we look at, how this is emerging both globally and in the United States, we see that this potential has been acknowledged. It's a powerful tool that is at policy maker and utilities. It's within grasp, and really it's set to accelerate very, very quickly. So currently the state of affairs is, globally there's approximately, just shy of 60 megawatts that are globally installed in floating offshore wind. But what we're seeing is a trend, or what is slated here as a trend for very, very quick accelerations, moving, adding a couple dozen megawatts over the next 3 to 5 years, and then getting into an extremely rapid deployment with as much as almost 10,000 megawatts expected by the 2030s. And so that's part of what we have to keep in mind, is we're really going from sort of zero to hero in a very short period of time. But part of that is again coming back to the importance of the resource, the strategic opportunities, as well as the industrialization opportunity in order to achieve this level of installation. And that level of installation, coming back to the point specifically of industrialization, is a really important opportunity, right? So in order to achieve those massive deployments, it is incumbent upon the industry to be working in earnest to accelerate not only project conception, development, and installations, but also through that work to be accelerating a very important decline in the levelized cost of energy that is associated with any new emergent technologies. So this is certainly not a this is history repeating itself and not unique to floating wind, that has been borne out in prior renewables to date. So when we see, for example, the revolution that happened in the early 1990s with onshore wind, massive deployments globally of onshore wind helped to accelerate, the industrialization, standardization, and cost effectiveness of that resource. Same thing with solar in the 2000s. And then in offshore wind, shallow water, as we've been describing, that's been certainly the discussion, or the optimization that we've been seeing over the past decade. And as we move now into the next chapter of deep water wind, that's where our eye is collectively on the prize, both industry and policymakers, really working in partnership in order to accelerate and improve that offering as quickly as possible. And so, when we look to the diversity of foundation opportunities and concepts that exist today, there's a variety of technology. You say, how do these things float? Well, they float through utilization, really, of longstanding technologies and understandings from the oil and gas sector, using 40 to 60 years of applications that are tried, tested, and true, and adapting them now into applications that bring wind into the mix. So, handful of diverse technologies that are certainly relevant. I won't go into them now. Again, the slides in the webinar will be available, but we should be mindful that there are a diversity of technologies that are coming of age as we speak, and are part of this next chapter of acceleration and industrialization. And really, even in the past couple of years, that has already been accelerating very quickly. We've been seeing, again, the oil and gas sector and the lessons learned and tried and tested technologies, pivoting successfully into, in the early 2000s, into offshore wind, so hybridizing renewables and oil and gas expertise, continuing that advancement through 2011, and even as recently as this past year, where there have been tremendous growth and opportunities with the first sort of commercial scale projects coming into fruition, 50 megawatts off the coast of Scotland, and likewise, Hexicon, the company that I work for, very successful in the Celtic Sea with an early stage development there. So lots of growth potential and continuing quickly. I would also, they want to pivot to, okay, that's great globally, but what's happening here in the US? And so to level set very quickly in the United States, that decarbonization push has been likewise embraced heavily in the past number of years. The states to date have been leading the charge, and we're going to hear more about what the state of California has been busy doing over the past really decade in this regard and how that's accelerating. But it's also important that we acknowledge in the past 2 years, it's been a period of tremendous growth and alignment between the goals and ambitions of the states with the federal government. So the Biden-Harris administration in March of 2021 put forward an initial Jumpstart initiative that espoused a truly ambitious target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind installed by 2030, as well as pathways towards a fulsome 110 gigawatts by 2050. So these are significant numbers, and the importance of targets absolutely bears repeating. When we look to the 42 megawatts that are currently installed, this goal starts to show, the trajectory between initial installations, contracts, as well as how state goals are going to help with that brief acceleration. And floating starts to come very much into focus now as we turn to the first floating market in the United States, which is California. And so, California's ambitions, as we'll get into with the commissioner, have been accompanied by recent announcements from the Biden-Harris administration, where they're looking at a goal of 15 gigawatts of floating wind installed by 2035. Their so-called floating wind shot, again, underlining the importance of goals and targets in helping to align policy and industry's interests. But we are also mindful that when we look to this 110 gigawatts by 2050 target, a significant portion of that is going to be in deep waters. So California is first on deck, but Oregon is likewise going to be deep water, the Gulf of Maine, parts of the Central Atlantic, and as states continue to grow their targets, it's expected that there's going to be more and more deep water presence that becomes relevant. So with that, hopefully we're all roughly on the same page, and it is indeed my absolute honor and privilege to be able to pivot momentarily into the introduction of our esteemed guest, Commissioner Vaccaro. But as we do so, I've referenced, the past decade's worth of work. This has been a long road, and that is accelerating rapidly with regards to the way that California, has been a truly innovative in all of its clean energy and renewable energy goals, and just the amount of work that is underway right now in the state of California bears underlining. So here, a couple of links that hopefully are useful to the webinar's participants to look at really a superb workshop that was held just last week by the Clean Energy, the California Energy Commission, but also diversity of state agencies that participate in this effort. So I'd encourage you, if you're not already attuned, to dig into the docket where all of this chatter is available and accessible to stakeholders and the industry, as well as the workshop that was held, which was, again, a really exceptional summary of the state of play, but also to look at the extensive amount of research and data that the state agencies have been accruing from a diversity of stakeholders and the diversity of scientists over the past decade through the offshore wind energy gateway. So again, these are just resources to help us level set and to dig in if you want to learn more. But without further ado, looking at 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Commissioner Kourtney Vaccaro. So Kourtney, if you can, there she is. Welcome, welcome.
Good morning and good afternoon. Adrienne, that was such wonderful context setting. Thank you so much for the level of detail and also for just bringing the excitement about floating offshore wind that we have here in California. Globally, I know there's excitement, but we're looking at the first ever offshore wind lease sale in California in federal waters before the end of this year. And that's pretty amazing. We're just anxiously awaiting the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to release the final sale notice for that lease sale and for the lease sale to get underway. So, and thank you so much, CESA and World Forum, for having me. Really glad to be here today.
Oh, that's great. Yes, I think we're all collectively chomping at the bit. Is probably the right characterization. But great. So let's dig in. Again, wanted to just offer a quick plug to those attendees. Please, by all means, we have a few questions that we're going to tackle here to get us rolling, but we're also interested in questions from the audience. So please do feel free to avail yourself of the Q&A function in the webinar platform. And we'll try to keep an eye out for those. But to get the ball rolling, Commissioner, I'd appreciate it if you could help us set the stage for California's ambitious climate and clean energy goals, and specifically how you believe that offshore wind is going to help California to meet those goals.
Yeah, perfect stage setting question. So California has very, very aggressive climate and renewable energy goals, and we're working hard and fast to transition our energy sector to clean electricity with a huge focus on decarbonization and electrification. And as we're doing this, we're facing the very real and very destructive impacts of the climate crisis. So our focus now is on strategies to strengthen climate resilience, climate change resilience, to advance zero carbon and renewable energy technologies and policies, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide. So I'll just give you a few examples, just sort of high level. With respect to greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking to decrease those to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. The governor recently signed a bill which puts in place a policy to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as is possible, but not later than 2045, and to achieve and maintain net negative greenhouse gas emissions thereafter. Transportation electrification is also a cornerstone to our policies. We have very aggressive zero emission transportation goals of 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035, and for medium and heavy duty vehicles by 2045. And just recently, in August of this year, the California Air Resources Board issued a new rule that basically establishes a year-by-year roadmap so that by 2035, 100% of new cars and light trucks that are sold in California will be zero-emission vehicles. And then finally, just touching on clean energy. Some folks have heard reference to what we call SB 100. The more formal name is really the 100% Clean Energy Act of 2018, and that is truly a pillar of our energy policy, and it requires that at least 60% of the state's electricity comes from eligible renewable energy resources by 2030, and that by 2045, all retail electricity sold in California and state agency electricity needs will be powered with renewable and zero carbon resources. And again, just recently in this legislative, in our budget session, the governor signed a bill that adds new timing requirements to meet those SB 100 goals. So just by way of example, 90% by 2035, 90% by 2040. We also accelerated the requirement by 10 years for 100% of electricity procured to serve all state agencies by 2035. And then there are other provisions to that bill as well. I'm just trying to give sort of the brushstrokes, but you can tell just from those examples how multifaceted this all is. I want to touch on one other thing because it really gets to the core of your question about where does offshore wind energy fit. So SB 100 tasked the Energy Commission along with partner agencies, the California Air Resources Board and the Public Utilities Commission, to prepare a joint report every 4 years that sort of addresses a number of factors in the law. That first report was issued in 2021, and it found that we need a significant build out of clean energy generation over the next 25 years in California. Just by way of just illustration, we need to be doing a record-setting capacity expansion where we are looking at, for the next 25 years or so, on average, we'll need to build 6 gigawatts of new solar, wind, and battery resources annually. And so as we look at our resource and technology mix, we see this real opportunity for floating offshore wind energy at scale to help us meet our climate goals and to really diversify our existing portfolio of resources and emerging portfolio of resources.
No, I mean, that's incredible, Commissioner, and I you know, a couple of things that stand out in that package, multifaceted as exactly the right word, but net negative after 2045. I mean, the level of ambition here simply cannot be understated or overstated. Excuse me. It's 6 gigawatts annually. I mean, that's just. So the CEC team and agencies are clearly busy.
Yes.
But again, it's yeah, understatement, right? But as we look to, I alluded to this a little bit in setting the stage. But part of what I think is so exciting and so interesting is that it's not only the level of ambition, right, and the nexus of beneficial electrification, rapid deployment. But there are also unique characteristics. So we see offshore wind as a tremendous opportunity. It's multi-gigawatt, highly complementary to the state's resource adequacy needs. It hits all the right notes in terms of really realizing the ambitions at scale. But we're into very deep water very quickly. So, what are some of the unique aspects that are part of California's experience, including, the outer continental shelf that, make California's journey here different from Europe or the East Coast of the US even, but also, to the extent that there are insights or lessons learned, how does this, what can be leveraged and what is novel?
Yeah, so great question. You really hit the nail on the head, I think, in your introductory presentation, which is that the waters and the Pacific Outer Continental Shelf, I mean, what you have are very rapid, steep drop-offs in very deep waters. So fixed bottom foundations are not an option in California. We can only look to the floating wind technologies. So right now, we're focused on 2 wind energy areas for the BOEM lease sale, Morro Bay and Humboldt. And, we're looking really at depths of 800 to 1,300 meters. And really, we're looking to get as far as 1,300 as we look at what the technology can do as it evolves. So that tells you're looking at extremely deep waters and ensuring that the technology can withstand the conditions of the ocean. And so for us, we've spent a lot of time focused on research and development in this space, as well as looking to the lessons, though, that were learned in the fixed bottom space, even though we know the technologies are different. So our East Coast partners and our international partners, I think, have been so gracious with their time, with their energy, and really explaining to us what they're learning, what they're seeing. So for instance, we have some memorandums of understanding, one with Denmark, one with Scotland relative to offshore wind, that set out mutual agreements for how we're going to exchange information. The Danish Energy Agency in particular really meets with us regularly and provides a lot of insights into what was learned in not only for technology deployment, but what it means in terms of sort of that social license and acceptance to the technology as well. As we look to the East Coast states, for years we've been looking to see what's happening. NYSERDA, for example, gave us some great insights before the proposed sale notice came out here in California, gave us a sense of how we can deepen and strengthen our conversations with BOEM in the development of the final sale notice. Already, some thoughts on what we could look to, and even helping to shape, to the extent feasible, the content of the proposed sale notice. And so that was really very helpful to us. I think, right now, we're looking at the roadmap that Maine is working on. You really called it out when you said Maine is one of the other states that right now is focused on floating technology. We're also really looking, even though there are some significant differences between California's transmission needs and strategies and what's happening on the East Coast, that multi-state East Coast RFI that's out right now looking at solutions for transmission is something that we have our eye on. So others being ahead of us, even if it's not the same exact technology, has really given us a platform, I think, to think carefully about what we're doing. And it also underscores that importance, right, of the outreach and the engagement with all of the stakeholders who are various and varied, and really, you know, what we can do to improve in those spaces as well. More to say. I feel like that itself is an hour-long conversation, but hopefully that gives you a sense that, you know, we really are looking at these partnerships and seeing a global and national community around floating offshore wind at scale and making it happen.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I can see, you know, where the inspiration from some of those mature markets and the Danish Energy Agency experiences. Certainly, you know, during my time at NYSERDA, it was, you know, that was a very important partnership as well for us in terms of lessons learned. I'm glad to hear of the, you know, the cross-pollination with, you know, with Maine. But it is indeed very intriguing, you know, some of the transmission discussion that has evolved over the past, you know, number of years. You know, it used to be such an uphill battle to talk about the merits of coordinated transmission, and we're finding ourselves in a very different dialogue now with, you know, BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Department of Energy, as well as states, you know, really leaning in, and even FERC, you know, really leaning into these opportunities, and the results are powerful. I mean, just as an example, you know, I think one of the studies in ISO New England in 2020, was it 2020 or 2021 that they did this study? Apologies if I'm misquoting, but, you know, they looked at different penetration levels into the New England grid and found, you know, that an injection of 8 gigawatts of offshore wind, you know, could do as much as or do as much to help support, you know, the unencumbrance of the winter peak and the volatility in the market, to drive rates down by as much as 50% for New Englanders. I mean, you know, again, if you start thinking about scale, and that really leads, I think, into the next question, is you know, being able to lean early into scale. So, you know, in August of this year, the commission set, you know, preliminary offshore wind planning goals for projects in federal waters off the coast of California. And here, you know, I was incredibly encouraged, as well as, you know, congratulatory to see that scale is what you lean into, even though appreciating that they're planning goals, they're stretch goals, and they're ambitious. But, you know, 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. So I have a number of questions, as you can imagine. But part of what I just want to impress for our listeners is, you know, it can be so beneficial to think at scale in terms of how you attack each of these questions. You know, social license, transmission, you know, planning, all of the above, you know, come into a very different focus when you think 25 gigawatts by 2045. So anyways, with that, a couple of questions. How oftentimes, you know, we're hearing about the multitude of agencies, you know, federal and state agencies. We've referenced BOEM, we've referenced Department of Energy, but also within, you know, the California state family, there's so many different organizations. Can you describe a little bit about how the state agencies are working together to advance policy and necessary infrastructure in view of these goals? And also, you know, we hear oftentimes this sort of all of government or whole of government approach. What does that mean?
Yeah, so many good questions, so much to unpack there. I think I'm going to go backwards a little bit before we go forwards, if that's okay with you, because you've really hit on scale. And our focus here, right, is really getting to utility scale. And you set the stage again earlier by explaining that there is floating offshore wind that we can say is commercial scale, but we're still talking, you know, in the megawatts. And we really right now in California, nationally, globally, are focused on how do we get to these large gigawatt numbers. And so Yeah, we're really pleased here in California, and particularly at the Energy Commission, for that action by the Energy Commission to move forward with establishing these they are very ambitious planning goals, but we see that they have to be, because that's how you get to scale and how you get there, I think, quickly. And we also know here in California, we have to do it with all of the different state agencies with different missions, priorities, and goals, pulling in the same direction. And that's something that we have been doing for a number of years now. So while the Energy Commission is, identified through some landmark state legislation and otherwise as sort of a central convening figure, and we have some responsibilities in law, and we'll touch on those in a bit, to develop a strategic plan for offshore wind, we do this in concert and in close collaboration with the California Coastal Commission, the State Lands Commission, Ocean Protection Council, California Public Utilities Commission, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, two governor's office entities, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and really critically, our Labor and Workforce Development Agency. So all of us, are working together. We have different missions. Our agencies exist for different reasons, but we're all committed to doing our part to meet the state's clean energy and climate goals. And so what that means is we work together to find the solutions, right? As we're looking at offshore wind energy, I think a perfect example of this most recently is if you look at the 9 state agency letter that was submitted to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in response to the proposed sale notice. We spoke with one voice and really said these are California's priorities. But in order to do that, right, we had to first develop relationships. We worked together regularly. I think Mark Gold, who was formerly of the Ocean Protection Council, used to say in many public meetings that he just can't believe the number of meetings that all of these agencies have that are centered around offshore wind energy development. Easily three or so a week, several a month, and that's now really multiplied and intensified as the Energy Commission is doing its work to meet the requirements of developing a strategic plan for offshore wind energy. And so, I think another really good example is the California Coastal Commission's work when they had to review the consistency determinations that were put forward by BOEM for the 2 wind energy areas. And the Coastal Commission, first of all, that staff did an incredible analytical job and really looking at impacts and the breadth and depth and scope of potential impacts to marine and ocean resources, and importantly, on and offshore ocean users and communities that rely on the ocean for economic and other reasons. All of us pulled together, to provide data, information, whatever it was that the Coastal Commission needed. And of course, they are obviously well qualified and occupy this space, on their own, but we all came together as we could to support that work as well. And that work has found its way quite appropriately into the lease sale that BOEM is proposing. That was a conditional concurrence is what the California Coastal Commission ended up issuing with respect to those 2 consistency determinations. And BOEM agreed to import some very critical conditions to protect the ocean marine resources into the lease sale and make those requirements of the lease stipulations. And again, I think that just goes to BOEM being a good partner. It has been with us since 2016. The BOEM California Intergovernmental Task Force is a forum, right, for tribal governments, state, local, federal agencies to come together to talk about how to make this a reality in California. So those are just some examples, but daily we are in communication with our state agency partners to figure out how to make sure that we are thoughtful and responsible in meeting our goals with respect to offshore wind. That was a mouthful, sorry. I have so much to say. I love talking about this.
Yeah, it's it's like there's a few things going on, and you're in the thick of it. And so I think a couple things just in terms of the breadth of work and the amount of coordination, and absolutely we'd be remiss if we didn't give a proper shout out to Director Lefton at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and her team, and just how diligently they've been working. And it is this really important tension between wanting to move quickly and wanting to move diligently. And I think that's an area where I'd like to offer significant kudos. Again, going back to the amount of data, the gateway, if you've never been, like, go and click. There's so much data, and the amount of energy and brain power, as well as consultation, that has really come together to try to inform those processes is no mean feat. So you can look at it either as some combination of many hands making light work, or an enormity of cross meetings and herding of incredibly talented cats, but also just the diversity of voices. And I think that's something that bears important recognition. You spoke of the social license, lessons learned, and that is a core pillar of the intergovernmental task force process, as well as the work that the agencies have been trying to encourage is really that multitude of voices. But let's look a little bit at next steps, if we can.
May I add just one thing? Adrienne, you made a really good point, I think, and thank you so much in calling out the leadership of Director Lefton. She and her team, all the way through to Doug Boren, on the Pacific coast here, have just been, very good partners. But I think I would be remiss to not recognize the efforts as well of the Department of Defense in really, regularly communicating with us, and also trying to find, very good solutions. And one thing that we have going on right now, and I think it's born of just having regular communication and conversation and a collective willingness to problem solve, is a grant that the Energy Commission is administering, and we've got Cal Poly Humboldt involved in that as well, and we're really looking at transmission solutions between Southern Oregon and Northern California. And I just bring that up as another example of sort of the whole of government, the partnership of it, that is interagency within the state, but also other federal partners, including but not limited to BOEM, in trying to find solutions to make this workable at the scale and at the pace that's required.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a pivotal part of the March 2021 Jumpstart Initiative, right? Was the Biden-Harris government saying, "Hey, let us really make a concerted all-of-government approach." And so we've been seeing that at the state level, but likewise, having that fulsome partner. So DoD, absolutely, BOEM, of course, but also DOT, the Department of Transportation, right? We haven't even talked about ports, and that is probably yet another whole hour. There's so many conversations, but it really is, this multidisciplinary, multifaceted, multi-agency initiative. And I think it is incredibly encouraging to see that amount of alignment, 100%. So let's pivot to next steps. So the state enacted, in addition to the planning goals, an enormous climate and energy budget package, truly monumental in its conception, not just in terms of the dollar amounts, but just in its breadth. Can we talk a little bit about what those investments will do to advance offshore wind, and how does that tie into some of the next steps that the Commission is taking in order to implement Assembly Bill 525?
Yeah, so wow, we had monumental, I think is really the right word. I mean, just looking at the climate commitments alone, the state is looking at, I think, about $54 billion across several strategic priority areas. And some of that definitely is focused on offshore wind. One of the things that comes out of this budget that I think is truly important, and again is sort of showing California's commitment to investing in this space, is $45 million to fund the creation of a program to spur investment into ports and waterfront facility infrastructure. And as you well know, Adrienne, ports and waterfront infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and procurement are really critical as we are putting all the pieces of this puzzle together. So we're very, very excited about that. And, and that comes on the heels of funding from the 2021-2022 budget, where Energy Commission was able to make a roughly $11 million grant to the Humboldt Port District to really begin that important work of new development, retrofits, and looking at how that port can be a critical player, as we build out supply chain and, work to meet the planning goals. There's also money allocated, of course, just so that the state agencies can have the resources to meet all of the different requirements, principally the requirements of Assembly Bill 525, which is the law that came into effect January of this year that really accelerated the pace of the state, putting together a strategic plan. So Energy Commission has to develop a strategic plan by June of 2023. But the legislature and all of the different entities who are involved in that legislation's development recognize that there were really critical interim deliverables and analytical work that needed to happen. The first of which was really development of those planning goals. And right now, what we're focused on is meeting the requirement to have 2 reports issued by the end of the year. So December 31st is when we must submit over to the legislature and to the California Natural Resources Agency a report that is a permitting roadmap. That's something that we know that is also critical. That certainty, what's it going to look like, aligning local, state, and federal, not only the permitting, but also the environmental aspects of the permitting. So that's something that's going to be coming out at the end of the year. We're also right now focused on another requirement, which is developing a preliminary analysis of the economic benefits of making the investments in these port and waterfront facilities. And so you kindly mentioned that we held a workshop on October 6th, and it was a recorded workshop, and recommend folks taking a listen, to get a fuller sense of what we're doing. But we had that workshop because we wanted to show the work, the focus on the transparency of here's what we're doing to meet these December goals or December requirements, but more broadly, here's what we're doing here in parallel to meet the requirement for the strategic plan. So we're looking at an October 26 workshop that's focused on talking about identification of suitable sea space to enable us to meet these very ambitious planning goals. Welcome participation and feedback. Really, again, it's for us to show here's what we're thinking, here's what we've been looking at, here's what we're heading, where we're heading. But that's a space where we can really benefit from a lot of eyes and a lot of input. We're also looking at this end of this month to have a workshop with respect to that preliminary economic analysis. All of these things will be publicly noticed, but really, in order for us to be successful in this work, we have to continue to invite the public discourse. And another critical aspect of that is really doing the outreach and engagement with stakeholders of all kinds. We welcome the conversations with industry, but we also are focused on environmental justice communities, communication and connection as best we can with fishing communities, tribal governments, and others. So we've really been, putting the roadmap out there, I think publicly, but that workshop on the 6th, I think really let the sunshine in for where we are and where we're headed.
No, that's certainly a lot of wood to chop before the end of this year. I mean, those reports, each of them are non-trivial and extensive. And again, I would just put a plug to those who have not been following along quite as closely, in addition to the specific dates that you just enumerated, to the October 6th webinar, where there were easily a half dozen deliverables that were articulated that are underway, and the reports and the scoping and the amount of diligence that is involved. So, I think we can all look forward to staying tuned over the coming weeks, and certainly appreciate the amount of stakeholder engagement that is inherent in the work, essential to the work, but also the role of industry in complementing the state's dialogue there. So I'm just mindful of time. We have about 5 minutes left. I know this has gone incredibly quickly. So let's round out with maybe one last question, Commissioner. I'm curious, from the perspective of getting offshore wind energy to state homes, businesses and such, what are some of the top challenges that you think are particularly prevalent or unique to California? Maybe another way of saying this is, what keeps you up at night, or perhaps, the opposite, what makes you particularly optimistic?
Oh gosh. Okay, so what keeps me up at night? I mean, I think the climate crisis for me, is truly it's frightening, and I think every day throughout the nation and globally, right, we're just seeing the devastating impacts, and I think that also is a motivator. I think for me, for my fellow commissioners, for so many of the employees who work, in public service in the energy space and otherwise. Let's be creative. Let's be innovative. Let's move swiftly, and with purpose to address the climate crisis, to ensure that we have climate resiliency. And I think part of that in the offshore wind space is really, focusing on, I think right now, our transmission solutions. I think that's one very important thing, that's an important piece of this puzzle. And we have different requirements and constraints and opportunities in the North Coast and in our Central Coast. And we're very focused on that. Very pleased that we have a working group that's put together, Energy Commission, California Independent System Operator, California Public Utilities Commission, and others that are really working full bore right now to think about the transmission solutions, and at the same time to also think about the procurement solutions, because energy equity is very important. Affordability for ratepayers is important. So as we pursue all of these clean energy goals, we still want to honor, uplift, and advance so many other, priorities with respect to ocean values, protecting the ocean, and making sure that all Californians benefit. So it's a pretty tall order. And I feel privileged to be in this position, but at the same time, it is overwhelming thinking about how much needs to be done, and fortunate that so many of us are really pulling in that same direction.
Yeah, indeed, and I think we share the sentiment, in terms of you can feel overwhelmed by the climate emergency, and rightly so, but simultaneously, it's a call to action, and so the kudos to staff for the extensive amount of work that is targeted in this regard. I think, what was it? I thought I saw at one point in time almost, was it 42 positions that were being looked at the CEC right now? So can we just offer, a small plug that if anyone is
150.
Oh, good
Adrienne,
Lord! Oh my goodness!
We are looking to meet the responsibilities that we have been given, before and during like the most recent sort of budget cycle. We're looking to hire over 150 new staff, and it's a lot. It's a lot to bring in, to onboard, to retain. But I think we look at it so proudly that we're being entrusted to do so much in the energy space. But that's a lot of employees that we're looking. So we've got a bright, talented group here, and we're just looking to continue that. So thanks for the plug for anybody
Yeah,
who is
I'm happy to offer a shameless plug. You know, if you feel, you know, the conviction in listening to this webinar to engage in the climate fight, you know, there's a role and there are opportunities, and we need, you know, top minds and top talent. And you get to work with the commissioner. So here we go. So with that, I think that rounds us out in terms of time. Commissioner Vaccaro, thank you so much for the opportunity to connect, and truly congratulations on, you know, the scale, the breadth, the multifaceted nature of the work, how complementary these different pieces are to the collective vision of, you know, climate action, mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency simultaneously, and the work to engage stakeholders along the way. So again, thank you sincerely for your time today. I know you're a very busy woman, but also, you know, the benefit of this conversation, and even more importantly, for your work and your leadership in this space. Truly an honor to connect. So with that, I guess that rounds out our webinar for today and our fireside chat. It was pretty cozy. So thank you again for joining. Thank you to the World Floating Wind Association, as well as CESA, for your continued leadership. And again, you know, thank you, Commissioner, for your time, your perspective, and your leadership.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks
Thank
all.
you both.
Thank you.